Happy Sunday, everyone. Welcome to another Radical Futurist Playground. We're going to be talking about climate action and climate justice and more ways that we can engage around this topic as a community, thinking about the future, the present, and also understanding the past. So, just to give you a little bit of understanding about what climate justice is, it's a term as well as a movement that really acknowledges climate change that can have different social, economic, public health, and other adverse impacts on underprivileged populations. That's from Yale. So basically, what that means is that the ways that we interact with climate and the issues that it creates has different intersectionals and interplaying sort of realities for different populations. And it recognized that people who have traditionally marginalized backgrounds, working class, people of color, island nations, the global south interact with climate change in a different way, and they're impacted in more deep ways, even though they may not have been the people who were creating the realities of climate change. So really it's like a catastrophic scenario that we're living in, and it is resulting in from centuries of exploitation and oppression through colonialism and extractivism, as well as capitalism. Essentially, our socio-economic model is deeply flawed and urgently needs to be replaced. It's a system where rich nations, like I mentioned, are responsible for 92% of global emissions, and specifically the richest 1% of the world population are responsible for the double pollution produced by the poorest 50% of the countries. So we're going to be guided by the historical struggles and lived experience that are most affecting the people and how we're going to be interacting with them. So today we have Hua Wang. He's the chair of the Sierra Club Capital Group. How you doing today, Hua? You're on mute.
Sorry, I'm doing okay. I've been visiting the Kerry Tree Archive. Actually, this is actually an effort started by a community organizer here named George McDowell. You can see here this is like multi-year effort. As of now, they planted behind me is a pollinated garden. It will hopefully flower in a year or so. And down there, as I'm walking, there's a fruit orchard. And I personally planted a couple of trees in this area as well. So according to George McDowell, about 500 volunteers have contributed to this tree archive. I mean, it's one way that the community, at least in Kerry, is trying to contribute and fight against climate crisis, if you will. And hopefully it's something that I would like to see in other places like Raleigh and such, to be very honest. And yeah, behind me, this is the orchard. So yeah, right back to you. How are things going for you? You're muted, by the way.
Things are going really great today, Wah. I definitely want to get to you about some specific points, really as they relate to the local Raleigh political area that we are in. And you're deeply connected into like not just the environmental scene, but also the housing scene, as well as the scientist scene here.
Yes.
So recently I was reading an article from Grist, and it was talking about how the redistricting that we're seeing across the country could make it harder for tribes to protect the environment. So specifically in February, the Navajo Nation sued the San Juan County in New Mexico over new redistricting plan. And San Juan County is a district that stretches across a large part of the Navajo reservation and has enough indigenous voters to be a majority in actually 2 different voting districts. So the Navajo Nation lawsuit is arguing that the country's redistricting plan packs these voters into a single voting district, which dilutes the power of indigenous people at the polls and also violates the Voting Rights Act. And I know what here in North Carolina, we are a state that is deeply marred by gerrymandering, and how gerrymandering deeply affects the ability for communities to be able to make their voices heard, specifically from an environmental standpoint. So can you talk more about like what's going on here with that?
Yeah, I will give you a bit on what's going on with Raleigh specifically. So, many people, when you talk about gerrymandering and redistricting, we're thinking in the context of statewide, right? Well, there's a citywide redistricting in Raleigh that's essentially gerrymandering, because what's happened on March 1st, 2022, the Raleigh City Council voted to basically move at least two minority majority precincts. That's basically area that's largely, Black, Latino, immigrant community into a whiter district that will effectively dilute the voting powers, especially for the Black community in Raleigh. Now, as of now, there are two letters sent to the City Council, one from Southern Coalition of Social Justice, and the other one's a letter that's signed by the NCAAT, the El Pueblo, and NC Counts, basically saying that the city needs to redo and have a more equitable map, as opposed to the one they voted to approve on March 1st. And it's kind of frustrating that this is not getting more airtime locally, because I'm speaking from my.
Oh no, did we lose Wah? Oh no. So we're having some technical difficulties. I think Wah was going more into he's gone, how really this issue is deeply affecting this city, as well as the ability for people to be able to have like accurate representation within their communities. And that's something that, here at the Radical Futurist Playground, we really want to talk more about, because if we're talking about building a future, these maps are going to be set for the next 10 years until the next census, which is going to be in like 2030. And as these communities are changing, and as we're still talking about combating a lot of these social and economic and environmental issues, how are we representing these communities for the future? It is a very serious question. I'm hoping that we can get Wah back here pretty soon.
Until
then, we have Zainab.
Hi, Mary.
Good to see you.
We're gonna have some audio feedback here, so we're gonna have to like mute and stuff, which is why I was avoiding coming on screen. But I think you asked him a great question.
Do you want to talk more about the redistricting that's happening along Western Boulevard?
The redistricting that's happening around Western Boulevard. Let's see. There's so much around it. Like it's I think one thing is that it's all very strategic. I think that we have to figure out how we organize ourselves as people and communities, and how we like start living in a way where this stuff is more like knowledge rather than stress, because it's always going to be here and coming, but some stuff is just a little bit more serious and has a lot more consequences. So for redistricting sounds really boring, and I know especially for like young people it's like, well, voting doesn't matter, but also it's like, dude, this is like the root and foundation of where systematic oppression builds up from. So it's, for me, like I think it's really going back and like and thinking of it that way. Like it's difficult and hard, but in Raleigh you have a city that I think we sometimes we sit here and we're like, for some of us, like me, like I grew up here, so I'm like, this is my hometown city. Like I knew it when it was like when it wasn't famous. Like I knew you back then, like before everybody was, like
Yeah.
stuff. And so it's hard to think of it as a place where people, have now seen the land is valuable, that the people are valuable, that the tech is valuable, the research is valuable. And you're like, oh, okay, when more people see that, more people are like, oh, how can I utilize this space for my own good and my own profit? And it's why right now organizers and leaders and stuff are so important, because they have a more historical knowledge that sometimes when we're in the like fury of things that we forget. So it is important to note that, like, you know, city council and stuff, especially in Raleigh, is going to say a couple of different things, but you know, we'll be here, and it's why, like, I'm excited to have this conversation this week specifically with the climate strike, because it all fits in. Like the redistricting, it's not just impacting voters, it's impacting our water sources, it's impacting our food, and we're seeing that, you know, there's this an annual climate strike this Friday. And I am excited to hear this conversation with you and Will, because I've known Will for a little bit from the Poor People's Campaign, and have learned so much, especially about indigenous folks and the sacredness of our land and our water, from Will, and being also involved in these movements with the Poor People's Campaign, and other coalitions for environments and stuff. So I'm going to let you have this conversation with Will, because I see he's here. He is here. But we're going to see Will. Will, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
We can.
Hi, Will. How you doing?
How are you?
Hey, what's up, y'all? How y'all doing?
So Will, it's so great that you're on the call today. You're so deep.
I always want to remove myself, and Will removed him. He probably having, you know, technical difficulties. We gotta expect this as organizers, y'all. Like, if you're watching, like, we call it technical difficulties, but people don't want us to have this conversation. It just dropped. Join back, Will. I forgot we're live. This is why I shouldn't be on camera.
Honestly, I want to get to something that you said, specifically around how the valuation of this city and the land has really changed the landscape and the future that they're trying to create. And it's so funny because the reality of environmental injustice is caused by different areas being considered invaluable, and they become sacrifice zones for overpollution.
Hear you all. Oh, maybe I was the technical difficulty. Oh no. Will, can you hear us?
I can now. Can you hear me? I turned my camera off.
Yeah,
That'll help.
time we got you. We got you. You can keep the camera off, Mary. I'm out. You're gonna have this conversation.
Mary, I think you're on mute.
Hello?
I got you. I can hear you now.
So one of the things
Technical
that I want to talk to you about,
difficulties in this age of COVID. Technical difficulties.
you cannot escape them. It's literally impossible. You just have to roll with the punches, and I appreciate you for rolling with us. So one of the things that I did want to talk to you about today, now that we have you for this time period, what do you see like being some of the most pressing like environmental and climate issues that this state is facing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what we have to recognize really is, first off, the climate crisis in the midst of all other social crises really forms our generation's urgency of now. It's a crisis that is of such an unprecedented scale that no one sector of society that we might depend on for solutions can do it on its own. I say this all the time. Community organizing can't do it on its own. Government can't do it on its own. The nonprofit sector can't solve it on its own. Private finance can't solve it on its own. Um, and structures that we just have depended on cannot solve this thing on its own. So one of the more pressing issues is first recognizing and understanding that we have to develop as a generation of new politics, meaning we have to lean into this notion of fusion politics, this notion of intersectionality, this notion of breaking down silos to really understand and analyze, this climate and environmental crisis, but through the lens of other socioeconomic issues like gender equality, like environmental racism, like poverty and inequality, which I know Zainab mentioned some work that she's done, in the Poor People's Campaign. That's really, a part of that urgency of now is we have to understand how these issues intersect and play upon people's lives, especially the most vulnerable among us. Number two, when you talk about urgent issues, this movement has evolved over, and environmental justice has really become a central narrative, as where we are. But in doing that, those words threaten to just be buzzwords of the day, where people say, we need to have a movement that's based on climate justice, but not really understanding what that means. There is a legacy and a history of movement here that lay out principles and ways, processes that we actually have to abide by if we're going to be accountable to a climate justice movement. We have to recognize that right now, this year, 2022, is the 31st anniversary of the first people of color convening in Washington, D.C., where the 17 principles of environmental justice were adopted. And we have to know that, but also the history of organizing behind that, right? Where communities that were impacted, Black communities, brown communities, communities on the front lines, literally had to become advocates for themselves because the science did not yet exist, or rather the government wasn't paying attention to the realities that they were facing in terms of disproportionate exposure rates, in terms of, increased emissions, in terms of higher levels of pollution in their areas. And so that reality led to a wave of organizing, which culminated in a couple of things. Is one, the United Church of Christ toxic waste and race study that actually launched the environmental justice movement here in the United States, and the 17 principles of EJ, being a real inflection point coming together and a power building moment for that movement, where people, especially indigenous organizers, came together and drafted these principles saying, this is what our movement needs to really embody, right? This year is also the 40th anniversary of the 1982 Warren County protests. Now, what are the Warren County protests? Many people cite that as being the birthplace of environmental justice here in the United States. Happened right here in North Carolina, right?
Yes,
like 40 minutes, from where we are in the Triangle, in Warren County. The issue there was that the state had planned to site a landfill for the disposal of PCB toxic waste in the heart of a county that at the time happened to have the most African Americans per capita in the state. It was one of the lowest income counties. Now, Warren County is symbolic for a number of reasons. One, the famous protest that came out of that, where people came together, young people, old people of different races, and say, you're not going to do this to one of our most vulnerable counties in the state. Now, the landfill did get cited there, but what happened? A national movement for environmental justice actually got birthed. Warren County is also symbolic because it speaks a bit more abstractly to when we're talking environmental and climate issues, how there always has to be a special lens for the impact that's happening in most vulnerable areas. What do I mean? Warren County is directly related to another environmental flagship moment, which is Love Canal. And if you're familiar with Love Canal, Love Canal happened in the 20th century, but was an issue where middle class, mostly white communities were exposed to toxic PCBs at Love Canal. Now that led to an actual pretty positive victory in that legislation was passed that mandated that PCBs be disposed of in proper ways to prevent exposure to populations. However, the PCB, that legislation led to a company here in North Carolina that did not want to abide by it, which basically they then dumped tons of PCB waste along North Carolina highways that eventually led to the state government saying, hey, we need to put this landfill somewhere to clean this up. Where are we going to put it? In a poor Black community. So that reality and that history shows us that one of the most pressing issues, of this time is to understand how even when we see perceived progress in the environmental and climate space, it always has to be filtered and analyzed through whether or not it answers and takes into account the impact for the most vulnerable populations amongst us. And then third, I'll say is, I really focus heavily on a lot of issues in the state. The climate crisis, of course, is really just this timeline that we all find ourselves in. You may have seen the most recent IPCC report that basically laid out, we have a ever shrinking window, less than 12 years now to make
the same thing every year.
Every year it's a countdown. Every year it's a countdown. Less than 12 years.
You're breaking up a little, Will. One more time?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So, the IPCC report basically lays out we have less than 12 years to take action on this global climate crisis and not prevent it, don't limit the current impact to what we're seeing. So, the current levels of extreme weather, the current flooding, the current food system, our natural cycle. That's incredibly and we have to make sure that policy look towards that happened most recently.
You're breaking up again a little. I'm so sorry that we're having these technical difficulties because I feel like we're really missing out on these really great points. I think I got the gist of what you were saying at the end around the IPCC report, saying that we have 12 years to not really eradicate climate change, but to limit the awful effects that we're going to face from flooding, from droughts, from all these other things that are related to the reality of what we're doing and how that interrelates to the realities of people's already long time struggles. I do want to make one point related to what you were talking about with Warren County, because I really think yes, that is, did we lose him again? One of the things he was talking about was that how Warren County was kind of the birthplace of the environmental justice movement. And that is very deeply true. It was a community that was coming together for the first time ever, in the history of the country, to really talk about the effects of what's happening in their community and coming together to combat that together. It was several days of protest, several people were arrested. They still ended up putting it there. But I think, one of the even more deeper realities of how the environment and the climate interact with each other is looking at the Memphis climate strikes that were happening. It was actually the last public speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave before he was murdered in Memphis. And it was really about the sanitation workers that were working at this particular center and the awful conditions that they were facing. It tied in the connection between workers' rights and the environment and civil rights and racial justice. So I think that honestly is a really great focal point for the reality of where we are and organizing and looking for a change in the future. And if Will were still here, I would talk to him more about the ways that he thinks that we should be creating a better future, since this is the Radical Futurist Lab. But he's not. We're having some technical difficulties. I'm glad you guys are still rocking with me. I'm hoping that we can get Wa back in a few minutes so he can talk about the climate strike that's coming up this Friday.
Yeah, well, technical difficulties, but Wa's here. You talk to him.
Wa, are you here? Can you hear us, Wa?
What about, are you planning the climate strike?
Yes, so I'm actually one of the, I am one of the organizers that is helping to coordinate the climate strike that is happening this Friday at noon. It's going to be in front of there's going to be several different locations, but it's starting at hey, wow, I'm so glad you're here, so I don't have to talk about this all by myself. So can you talk about some of the local actions that are happening, that are coming up in Raleigh to address these like intersectional topics of climate justice, abolition, all these topics?
So I can tell you, at least from the perspective of someone who is a local organizer, this goes beyond my work being a chair of the capital group. This goes into like what I do for Raleigh as a community organizer. One of them is the redistricting. That's not quite over yet. We're still trying to push back on the fact that the city council diluted the black voting power in Raleigh. There were 2 letters from SCSJ and also from NC Council saying that they need to change the equitable map. And there's I'm just gonna be frank, there's this is from a personal perspective, there's a letter campaign going around. We're asking folks to send letters to the NC Bar Association to basically file grievance against the city attorney and the city council member who happen to be attorneys for what they're doing that basically infringe upon the basic voting rights in Raleigh. And there's a Google Drive link that I can share. There's instruction how to get it done. Hopefully that's explanatory. The other one is the bus rapid transit. So there's a lot of concern with how the bus corridor that's being designed by a city is going to tear down a lot of black communities in Kentwood and Heritage Park, both of which are owned by the Raleigh Housing Authority under the federal HUD jurisdiction. And there are also other places like the Dutch Village, the Arbor Creek Method community. Method community is the oldest black community in Raleigh, and it does not seem like the city is paying attention or showing respect to that fact. I mean, they say it, but then why do you still upend people's livelihood? It's not only for black community. This is also where a lot of Muslim businesses and communities are also at, where they congregate and meet and have, bring families together. There's a life here. There's already a culture here. There should be more care taken to make sure that they are preserved, not having a street going through and basically changing their lives forever. And so that is something that we're going to be talking about in the coming weeks on the Radical Futures Lab. And the other one, I believe, is Global Climate Strike. I just showed a flyer. Is this Friday in downtown Raleigh. We'll gather at North Carolina General Assembly. That would be 16 West Jones Street this coming Friday from 12 to 2 p.m. And those are a couple of things that's going on for the next couple of weeks. And before I turn over to you, one other thing: the city of Raleigh is doing a draft annual action on their budget for this coming fiscal year, and that's where they're going to be talking about how they're going to use the money for affordable housing. I highly recommend folks pay attention to that. We can share the information for sure afterwards. So those are it. So back to you, Mary.
Thank you so much, Wa. I do want to note that Will had to jump out of the call because he was having some technical difficulties. So thank you for Will for showing up and just being a voice for change and for the future. Thank you to Wa for also being a voice for change and for the future. I really appreciate everybody for taking the time out today to listen, to be heard, really, because that's really where we're at with a lot of these things. As far as climate action goes for this city, this state, and this country, it's going to be an uphill battle. But I think, as long as we continue to engage with these things and look for different ways all of the different ways that, local governments and nonprofit organizations and like other groups can get together to create the future, then we're going to be going towards the direction that we need to. We don't have a lot of time, but hopefully we can get there. And so for the Radical Futures Playground, this has been Mary Black. Peace, love, and to the future.